Hi, thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. My name is Taylor Chambers, and I am the Georgia Associate Area Director with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Please let me know if at any point I'm too quiet, too loud. I know I'm trying to speak into a mic, so it's a little bit different setup for us, which is really fun. Um, Today's presentation is focusing on suicide prevention and what we can all be doing in our communities. If you are currently sitting at these rows of tables, you guys should have some information available, and one of those is a general brochure on our organization, and one of those is a brochure specific to Talk Saves Lives. If you do not have one, for whatever reason, just reach out to me after the presentation. I'm happy to give you one. So one thing I want to note is suicide can be a sensitive topic to discuss, but talking about suicide is critical to its prevention, and we are grateful that you have joined us for this important conversation. If at any point during this presentation it just becomes a little bit hard to listen to, you're absolutely welcome to take a step outside. If you want to connect with me after and we can talk about other resources as well, that's absolutely fine. What we know is that suicide is a complex health issue. Despite its complexity, we believe that suicide can be prevented. Just like there are warning signs and risk factors for other health crises like cardiac arrest, we can learn the warning signs and risk factors that can help us to prevent people from dying by suicide. As with other health issues, time can be a critical and life-saving measure. Typically, a life can be saved if you allow time for the person's suicide risk to subside or to get through the period of distress and to get mental health help. To prevent suicide, we need to identify persons who may be suicidal, as well as take an active role in connecting them to help before they take action to end their lives. The purpose of Talk Saves Lives is to provide community members with a general overview of what suicide is, who it affects, and what we know about how we can prevent suicide. This presentation will cover some statistics to give you an idea of the scope of the problem. We will review some key research findings, including the risk and protective factors that relate to suicide. As well, we'll talk about what we can all do to prevent the leading cause of death. How we talk about suicide matters. Before we get started, I want to go over some terminology that is used when we talk about suicide, and these are what we would consider kind of best practices. You might hear them commonly every day, and that's something that we're actively working on trying to change. But for the purpose of my presentation and the work that I do, I try to stick to kind of these guidelines and best practices. Our goal with this is not to perpetuate the stigma associated with the suicide and to help reduce the risk. So let's establish just this basic guideline for shared language. In our work, we like to avoid using the phrase committed suicide, as it has this negative connotation. Instead, we like to use phrases like died by suicide, ended his or her life, or killed himself or herself. You wouldn't say somebody committed cancer, so you wouldn't say somebody committed suicide. In addition, when talking about suicide and suicide attempts, we always avoid referring to suicide as a failed or successful attempt. Our goal is to save lives, and so any suicide attempt where a person lives, that's something we want. That is a success to us. Additionally, saying attempted suicide implies that person did not die, and saying death by suicide then implies that person had ended their life. Suicide is a significant issue that affects individuals, families, and communities worldwide. I'm going to start with the scope of the problem to demonstrate some basic statistics and give you an idea of what this looks like here across the country, around the globe, and a little bit in Georgia. So we know that suicide is a global problem. Over 800,000 people die by suicide each year, and that's according to the World Health Organization. This is the most accurate data we have available, but we estimate the numbers to likely be higher, and part of that is the difference in recording standards and underreporting, and even in our own country as well as across the world. Every 40 seconds, we know someone dies by suicide. In the United States, suicide rates are recorded by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the most recent data we have right now is 2016, but now in 2019 we'll hopefully have the 2017 data. In that year, almost 45,000 people died by suicide, which made it the 10th leading cause of death in the US. Together, if you were to look at lives taken by homicide, war, and natural disasters combined, suicide still takes more lives every year in America. These high numbers are one of the many reasons that it's important to talk about suicide like any other illness. And the more we talk, the less stigmatized it can become. For every death by suicide, we estimate that 25 others attempt suicide. That's about 1 million Americans each year who survive a suicide attempt. And we know that many more people struggle with suicidal thoughts beyond that. When you think about any loss, it impacts many people in the community. Suicide is no different. The loss affects families, friends, coworkers, church communities, faith communities, and schools. It is estimated that the majority of Americans will experience a suicide loss over the course of their lifetime. In addition to the devastating toll that suicide has on families and communities, both emotionally and socially, there is a fiscal impact on our society as well. The CDC estimated that for 2016, if you looked at all of the deaths we had by suicide as well as the suicide attempts, we probably lost an average of $69 billion. And that's primarily due to lost wages and productivity. So now we're going to move on a little bit to looking at the research that we've done. I think it's important to kind of frame it and why this is a problem and how large this problem is, what the scale is. But it's also important to talk about what we're doing about it. So over the past several decades, scientists have been studying suicide, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is the largest private funder of suicide prevention research. So this area is going to give us some more information about what we've learned as a result. One of the main questions research explores is, why do people take their own lives? Through research, we have learned that there is no single cause for suicide. Suicide most often occurs when several stressors and health issues converge to create an experience of hopelessness and despair. It's a really important thing just to remember is that oftentimes you can frame it as a single event caused by one action or one thing. You want to do that, but we know that that's not true. Research has consistently shown that the large majority of people who die by suicide have a mental health condition at the time of their death. It may have been misdiagnosed, it may not have been diagnosed, or it may not have been adequately treated. That said, research has also made clear that mental health conditions cannot be the whole story. Mental health conditions are very common, and the vast majority of people who suffer from these illnesses do not die by suicide. In addition to other mental health conditions, there are many other factors that increase risk as well. We've learned that the brains of people who die by suicide differ from those who die from other causes in terms of structure and function, specifically in the areas related to stress response and impulse control. We've also learned that people who are suicidal are ambivalent about taking their life. Part of them wants to live, but part of them wants to die. The research has informed key strategies in suicide prevention that involve engaging the part of the person that wants to stay alive and helping to create distance between that person and the part of them that wants to die. One way we do that is to help the person connect with reasons for living, while at the same time decreasing the visibility and presence of things around them that may facilitate their desire to die. One of the many important things we have learned from research is about the perspective of a suicidal person, that a crisis point has been reached. For a suicidal person, the pain seems unbearable, whether it's emotional pain, physical pain, or sometimes both. For just a moment, I'd like you to think about maybe the most physically painful moment of your life, if that was childbirth, if you broke a bone, and just think about that moment. In that moment, do you think you could have told somebody, where you were, what you were going through in exact words? Do you think you could have given clear and accurate directions to your house if somebody had asked? And probably not. That's what we know. We know that research for this is what's so important, and knowing that mental health conditions, we can look at them just like physical health conditions. Research has also helped determine the key factors to increase the risk for suicide. Risk factors are defined as characteristics or conditions that increase the chance a person may take their life. Risk factors are important to know, to understand, and to understand the big picture of someone who is considering suicide. Just like someone who is at risk for heart disease because of high blood pressure or a history of heart disease in the family, some people are at higher risk for suicide than others. The main risk factors shown here can be grouped into 3 categories: health factors, historical factors, and environmental factors. The first type of risk factors include health factors, such as biological and psychological medical conditions, the most significant of which are mental health conditions. As we said before, most people who die by suicide have an active mental health problem at the time of their death. Depression is the most common mental health condition and is the one that is most associated with suicide, but we know that it's not just depression that can help lead to suicide. Bipolar disorder is also shown to increase risk and be a high risk, but we know that bipolar disorder is less common than depression. And because these conditions put a person at greater risk for suicide, detecting the presence of a mental health condition is critically important. The best way to be sure when you feel concerned or to detect a possible change in you or your loved one's mental health condition is for the person at risk to seek a professional evaluation and effective treatment. Many people may not realize that their distress has actually become a health problem. Providing information such as a crisis number or mental health resource to someone who is struggling can be a solid start to getting them the help they need. Mental health conditions are not the only health factors that are associated with suicide risk. Serious or chronic conditions can increase the risk, especially when the person additionally has a mental health condition. Things like chronic pain and serious head injuries have also been shown to increase suicide risk. The second type of risk factors include historical factors such as a family history of suicide, a family history of mental health conditions, or past trauma such as sexual abuse or combat stress. Research has also found that a history of childhood abuse can contribute to suicide risk. And while most people who attempt suicide do not go on to die by suicide, previous suicide attempts are also considered historical risk factors, which put someone at risk in the future. The third type of risk factors are environmental factors that involve the circumstances of a person's life. And I think when people tend to think of suicide as a single cause, these are really the ones that people focus on. These are often aspects of a person's environment that can contribute to overall level of risk, but ultimately are unlikely to be, a leading risk. So having access to a way of killing oneself is referred to as lethal means, and that's the biggest one. This includes having access to a variety of things such as firearms, drugs, a bridge, or a car. And research has shown as well that contagion, the exposure to another person's suicide, and we see that throughout the media or potentially in a school environment or a work environment as well. Or if there's a graphic or sensationalized account of the suicide, that this can also lead to an increased risk. The environmental factors that may lead to an increased risk include prolonged stress, which could include things like harassment, bullying, relationship problems, legal problems, and unemployment, and stressful life events, which may vary across the lifespan, and these can include things like divorce, legal problems, or an unexpected job loss. To better understand suicide risk, here is an example of a set of risk factors that could converge in a person who is suicidal. This example shows what is often the public perception of suicide. When someone dies by suicide, often the story only talks about the environmental factors. People see a life event like a breakup or bullying or job loss, and they might see the person die by suicide then, and they might assume that that person had killed themselves because of that stressful life event. But that's never the full story. What others don't know is that the person who died may have had genetic risk for suicide. Maybe there was other mental health disorders going on like depression or anxiety. There could have been a more stressful situation at work or in the home, and all of those things together is what is going behind somebody, and more than just the environmental factors. Looking to the future, research will help us find the best ways to fight suicide. Research is looking for biomarkers. For example, something testable in a blood sample that would help us to identify those at risk. A number of clinical treatments, like particular types of therapy, are effective for suicidal people, and more needs to be developed and studied. The good news is that through research, we are learning more and more about what helps those who are in a suicidal crisis. Research can also help to identify the most effective interventions to reduce suicide rates. So now that we have a better understanding of the scope of the problem of suicide and the key research findings, including risk factors, the next section will focus on prevention. We will discuss the different types of protective factors with a focus on mental health, the importance of engaging in self-care, the need to provide support for suicide loss survivors and those with lived experience, and the critical prevention strategy of limiting access to lethal means. Just like there are risk factors that increase a person's risk of suicide, there are also protective factors that lowers a person's risk. If you are proactive about mental health and make an effort to get healthier, you protect yourself. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment too. Feeling connected to family and community support can protect against suicide. When someone is struggling with depression, anxiety, psychosis, or substance abuse, these protective factors that may normally be strong can erode and temporarily weaken. When that happens, having friends or family to remind us our strengths can be a tremendous protective factor. Problem-solving skills also help. Life can get really tough, but being able to see a way through problems can be a protective factor. And cultural and religious beliefs that encourage connecting and help-seeking and discourage suicidal behavior or create a strong sense of purpose and community can, in addition, be a protective factor. Because mental health care is so important for preventing suicide, we're going to focus on that topic a little bit more. Getting effective treatment for mental health conditions like depression or anxiety can prevent suicide. Critical to suicide prevention is getting people connected to mental health treatment. One of the biggest challenges in fighting suicide is getting people to address their mental health in the same way they would for physical health. In fact, of those suffering from a mental health condition, less than half seek treatment. We also know that people are more likely to go to their primary care doctor in the month before a suicide attempt than their mental health professional if they have one. One way to encourage individuals to seek help for their mental health conditions is to treat mental health like any other aspect of health. There are certain times when a person becomes ill and it's critical to seek a professional. Same things goes for mental health. We need a culture where everyone knows it's smart to take care of our mental health. And taking care of our mental health is just as important as physical health. Seeing a mental health professional is a sign of strength, and many are taking that step. The person seeking help should request a thorough evaluation to figure out if there's a mental health condition that may be affecting their life. There are many types of treatments available, like various kinds of psychotherapy and medications. Research has shown that for most people, the combination of psychotherapy and medications tend to be the most helpful. The good news is that advocacy efforts are improving access to mental health services so that most people can get the treatment they need. The law now requires insurance plans to cover mental health services on par with physical health services. If we need mental health services, and 1 out of the 4 of us will at some point, we should get treated and get our health back on track faster. Just like people can find strategies that optimize their physical health, people can do the same for their mental health. In addition to professional mental health care, proactive self-care strategies like good sleep habits, exercise, nutrition, and stress management can also play a critical role in protecting mental health and promoting resilience. Prevention efforts also include support for those touched by suicide. The loss of one person to suicide profoundly impacts many, the immediate family, friends, colleagues. And it's important that the survivors of suicide loss have the support they need, both to heal and to reduce their own suicide risk. And since those with lived experience, and that's the term we use for those who have attempted suicide or have experienced suicidal thinking, are at increased risk, we need to make sure that they have the support they need too. The most important thing you can do that you can put between a suicidal person and their way of ending life is time. Research shows that by temporarily reducing a suicidal person's access to lethal means, we give suicidal individuals time for that intense suicidal risk to diminish, and time for someone to intervene with mental health support and resources. For the majority of people who experience a suicidal crisis, if unable to access their chosen method, even temporarily, they are unlikely to engage in another activity to end their lives. In most cases, when a suicidal person doesn't have current access to the means that has been on their mind, they don't substitute with another method. A clear method then is to limit this access to lethal means. So during a period of high risk, the safer their environment is, the better chance a suicidal person has of living through the crisis period. Suicide prevention research has looked at a number of ways to create those safer environments. One example is installing an inexpensive carbon monoxide sensor that would automatically shut off cars if the carbon monoxide levels were to reach an unsafe level. We know that that would save lives. We've also learned through research that installing barriers on bridge deters suicides, and in many cases, bridge barriers have actually lowered suicide rates for the entire region. Restricting access to potentially lethal medications reduces suicide, and that could be as simple as blister packaging instead of putting all the pills in a bottle. And firearm safety is critical to reducing suicide risk. Half of all deaths by suicide are caused by a firearm. And so we know that making suicide prevention an important part of gun safety education and training is important to saving lives. So now that we've reviewed some of the key suicide prevention efforts and some of the facts and figures, I think it's important to talk about what you can do. I think that's probably what many of you guys are here for, and so we'll get a little bit more in depth into that. If you see someone who's struggling, it's important to have a caring, supportive conversation. And a conversation is a way to show that you care. It's allowing them to gain some trust from you and for you to gain more information from them about what might be going on. So one important thing to look out for are some of the warning signs. And these are warning signs both in yourself and others. While many of the suicide risk factors we discussed endure over a long period of time, warning signs are observable signs that signal suicide risk in the near future. It's important to pay attention to both the risk factors discussed earlier and the signs we are going to discuss. And if you see warning signs, reach out to individuals. If it's your life that you're concerned about, reach out for help. One of the things that we know is that we need to assume that you will be the only one to reach out. One of the things we hear a lot is, I wish I would have reached out. And if you're having that feeling about someone, reach out. If you're having that feeling about yourself, reach out. And if you don't get through the first time, try again. Keep trying. So some of the warning signs from suicide, we think of in three main categories for this as well: talk, behavior, and mood. Many people who are suicidal talk about ending their lives. This may be directly or indirectly. A person might say it outright, they might make a joke about it, but you have to take it seriously. Some people might say things like they have no reason to live. Others say things that maybe they feel like they're trapped or that they're a burden. Or they might talk about overwhelming or unbearable pain. And some people might directly say it. We should take all of these very seriously. Another thing to look for is behaviors that are atypical for an individual. Persons thinking about suicide can display certain behaviors that are unusual for them. And this may include things like an increased use of alcohol or drugs. It may cause trouble sleeping. That can either be sleeping too much or not sleeping enough. They might start acting recklessly. They might withdraw from activities, especially from activities they would normally enjoy. They might isolate themselves from family and friends. And they might also look for a way to kill themselves, such as searching online for methods or beginning to shop for a firearm. They may also start giving away their possessions or continue in reckless spending or things like that, which would be a related behavior. Some other things to look for are moods or attitudes. And we talked a lot about depression and how we kind of think about that as a risk for suicide. We know as well that things like apathy, rage, irritability, impulsivity, humiliation, and anxiety are some of the other moods that a person might exhibit when they feel overwhelmed or desperate. We all have ups and downs in our mood, but when you notice a change that seems uncharacteristic or concerning, it is important to speak to the person about what you are noticing. For example, sudden unexplained happiness can indicate that the individual may have come to terms with the plan because they will no longer be in pain. So even those spikes in mood that are positive could be a sign. There are a lot of things to look for and a lot that we've talked about today, but to sum it up, we want to look for changes in behavior and trust your instincts, trust your gut. Like I said, assume you're the only one who is going to reach out. And this is a good rule of thumb. If you are wondering if someone is depressed or overly anxious, that's a sure sign you should reach out. If you're concerned about one of these signs, you think you've seen that before, reach out. So how do you reach out to someone? I think that's another great thing to think about. A key thing is to talk to them in private. I wouldn't yell across the room right now at one of you that I'm concerned if I knew you better. That would be inappropriate and that would make the person feel uncomfortable. We also want to be empathetic and listen to their story. We don't want to overtell our story or, just give immediate guidance. We want to express concern and caring, and we want to ask directly about suicidal thoughts. The most important thing you can ask somebody who you're concerned about is, are you thinking about suicide? Being direct, asking directly is important. And encourage them to seek mental health services. And if they are in crisis, take them to help. Some other things to avoid is minimizing their feelings. Those of us who have never experienced major depression literally cannot imagine what it feels like. For the men in the room, literally cannot imagine childbirth. It's, we want to think about it the same way. You can literally not imagine this. And trying to convince them that life is worth living is an ineffective strategy. If this person is at a crisis point in their lives, they're not thinking about things in a necessarily logical way that would make sense. And avoid giving advice to fix it. If a person's having a heart attack, you wouldn't say, well, you should really change your diet. That's something that you want to focus on maybe before, but in the middle of a crisis is not really helpful to that moment. And if you think that someone might make an attempt on their life, in the immediate future, don't leave them, stay with them. If you think that you yourself are at risk, you should leave, but call 911 immediately. Part of staying with them is removing lethal means. If you know they have access to a gun, it could be getting them a gun lock. If you know they have access to medications that they shouldn't or anything like that, make sure that you're able to kind of get these lethal means away from them. And then escort them to mental health services or to an emergency room. And most importantly, these are 2 numbers that you guys have provided in the information I've given you, but you're welcome to take out your phone, take a picture, put them in your cell phone now. Even if you don't think that you will ever need to access the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or the crisis text line, you never know when someone might. And to have those numbers on hand is super important. And the other thing to note is that if somebody is in crisis and you are very worried about them in that moment, call 911. For both of the Lifeline and the crisis text line, they're both 24/7, 365. So together, we can create a culture that's smart about mental health, will save more lives, and will vastly improve the lives of many more. It's simple, but it's important. Talk saves lives. It works. So that's really everything I have today. I am happy to stick around and answer any questions anyone might have. And if you have an opportunity, we are always trying to improve the program provided. You're welcome to go to afsp.org/TSL participant, and that'll give you a form to fill out with that as well. Are there any questions I can answer? Yeah.
I don't know if you have this data. Do you know the data on the age group? Because on TV sensationalized stuff, but it appears that it's younger and younger. Like 8, 9 years old. So is it over sensationalized, or is this becoming a problem at younger and younger ages, in your opinion?
That's a great question. So what we know is that suicide is the second leading cause of death in those under 18. So that is a number that has been growing. But what we also know is that those 65 and older actually have more deaths by suicide each year. So when we think about our younger population, they don't have all those other risk factors really at that point. They don't have the heart disease and things like that the older population does. So it's a lower in the leading causes of death the older you get, but more deaths by suicide. So we are seeing this is the second leading cause of death in our youth, and things that we're actively working to change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To piggyback on her question, I read somewhere where the numbers are trending upward in the African American community as far as teenagers. Is that true?
I can't speak specifically for demographics, and I think part of that too is our data is pretty outdated right now. And so I think that we do know that there are groups of higher risk. And so one of those groups, certainly, we're looking at our African American community, our indigenous populations. And this is a kind of interesting statistic, but males are much more likely to die by suicide. Females are more likely to take their to attempt suicide, but males are more than twice as likely to die by suicide. So we do know that we have some work to get done around special populations and all people.
Do you have any statistics on the Douglas County, Douglasville area compared to other Atlanta metropolitan areas?
I definitely do, just not memorized. So I can send that after the fact to Caitlin. But we know that in Georgia, it's our rural populations that are at highest risk. So Douglas, we still consider kind of part of that metro Atlanta area, but it's our, like, if you go towards the coast and you go north and south, that's really our highest risk of a suicide loss.
Would you just mind showing some of your earlier slides? I'm sorry I was late, and I thought the discussion about language was pretty useful.
Sure, I can go back to that slide. I hope I'm going to the right slide for you. Is this the slide you wanted? Okay, thanks.
While you're looking at that, is it true that more males are successful in committing suicide because they're more likely to commit suicide, or sorry, not commit suicide, I'm sorry,
It's okay.
to take their lives with guns, and females are less likely to take their lives with guns?
Certainly, yeah. So one of the statistics I gave earlier too was that guns are used in 50% of suicides. And if that number is consistent across years, across populations, but certainly we do believe that this is because that males are more likely to potentially carry firearms, to own firearms, and be involved in that community. Females certainly are as well, but not to the extent that males are.
So is suicide something that,
Is suicide something that for middle school age children that can, I guess, be influenced by another person?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, this is something that we are really working on, and I wish I had a better answer for you right now, but we know that contagion in middle school students, especially in that youth population, is much more dangerous than it is in older adults. And part of that is when you think about, the formation of the brain and that fully developed process is, once you're over the age of 25 and your brain's fully formed, you can have more of those kind of logical thoughts around, when celebrities die or people around you die, that, okay, just because this person died, that's really hard, but maybe I need to seek help, or maybe I need to talk to someone. We know that children don't have the same coping mechanisms that we do. And so part of that is we've really worked around safe messaging. So I know kind of popular was the Netflix show, 13 Reasons Why. One of the things that we did was eventually Netflix put information at the end of each episode with resources for getting help. So shows that are geared towards children, things like that, and when it's published in the media, what we can try to do is make sure that safe messaging is out there. And then some of that includes, we don't want any information about method of suicide to be published. That's just, it's for lack of a better word, it's gross. We don't need that out there, and we know that that's one of the risk factors as well for suicide. So we do see that contagion is much, to answer your question shortly, contagion is much more of a risk factor in the youth, yeah.
so their social environment is
Absolutely.
plays an okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I know you said you really don't have any statistics, but I know when social media first came out, there was more of a spike in, suicide due to bullying and cyberbullying and things of that nature. Just since that, do we know if that has creeped up or if it's come down some?
So one of the things to keep in mind is that we don't really have a great sense for that, and part of that is it's knowing about it. So when you think about pre-social media and how the news operated then, how suicide was reported then, if it was reported, how things were, like in obituaries, how suicide was talked about was different. I think certainly we can look at kind of how we are all interconnected, and social media can provide a protective factor if you have a sense of community. But we do want to be careful with the increase in bullying and what we're seeing around social media, and making sure you know what your children are up to, as cliche as that sounds. But if you're worried about them, having a conversation and taking steps that might be right for you, and if it's shutting down social media, if it's watching computer time, things like that. But we know that that's certainly a risk factor, just not how much that's contributing.
Not enough. Could you talk about impulse versus planning? You talked a lot about prevention, and it sounds like many people who die by suicide have really planned or thought or attempted a number of times. Talk about impulse, particularly again in middle school.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to look at suicide, and it's one of those is the kind of suicidal ideation, which is having those suicidal thoughts. And that is an area where we really want to make sure somebody is able to get help. The act of suicide is it's a temporal action. And so what that means is the more time we can put between someone who's thinking about suicide and any way they would have to potentially take their lives is the more successful we can be in preventing suicides. So, and this research is ongoing and developing, but some of what's come out of that is it can even be minutes that you can stop somebody from wanting to take their own life if you put minutes between them and the potential potential lethal mean. So I think when it comes to middle school students, trying to figure out what your children have access to, and if that's taking appropriate measures to either make sure things are stored safely, or having a conversation about what's in the house and knowing what's in your house and things like that. But while the thoughts around suicide, we really can do a lot there. The act of suicide is something that even if you only have minutes or hours, we can still do something there.
Well, Taylor, thank you so much for coming out.
One more.
One more question?
Yes.
For people who have tried to commit suicide, what is the likelihood that they will eventually be successful?
Very unlikely. So we know that past suicide attempts are a risk factor for future suicide attempts. But what we also know is that people who attempt suicide are unlikely to die by suicide. So when we look at the broad spectrum of kind of help and things like that, that's certainly a group of people that need help. They need resources provided to them. But one of the slides I showed, and I can go back to it, it's all of these different things. The proportion of people who will die by suicide, for each one person who dies by suicide, 25 more people attempt suicide. So that's 1 of 25 that would eventually potentially die by suicide. And it's even lower than that if you think of the kind of the long-term risk factors versus a short-term risk.
Beyond this forum, how do you integrate yourselves or make the resources available for students?
So I have some more materials that I brought with me as well for specific for schools. I'm going to say up front right now, we do not have programming for middle school students. And I just got back from a leadership conference with my organization, and every single one of us said, where is it? We need it, and we need it, you needed it yesterday, we need it today, we need it tomorrow. And so the national level that we work with, they are working on this. The research that we fund is working on this. And so hopefully we will have direct programming for students available soon. We do have programming for high school students and older. But we know that for so many people, that's too late. So hopefully we will have that soon. Our goal is by our end of our fiscal year. So at the end of June, that's our goal to get something ready. And when we have it, I will reach back out and say, hey, I'm ready to come back and present anytime. But for schools, we have developed what we call kind of a postvention, which is if a school has a suicide, there are some things that we know we can do around that. And so that's all available online as well.
Okay. Well, Taylor, we thank you so much for coming out. And you guys, as she spoke about the mental health piece, you all should have a red slip of paper in your hand. On the back of that, we have 2 mental health providers here. We have Access Mental Health and King Counseling, who are here to take any questions that you have. Taylor talked a lot about prevention, and this is a great time to connect with these providers for prevention for yourselves or for your loved ones or for your students. So thank them, we thank you guys for being here and for being able to provide those services for us. And we're gonna do a raffle. So on your sheet in the inside, there is a number, and I'm gonna ask Taylor to come and choose 2 raffles for Chick-fil-A gift cards. So if you just choose a number. Number 18. Number 18. There's Chick-fil-A gift card and one more. Number 5. 5? Always lucky number 5. In the pound. Well, we'll go one more. The vendors, this is for you too. You don't have number 5? Okay. All right, one more time. Thank you all for being honest. One more time. 17. 17. Yay. My handwriting is a little off. Okay. I'll see if our principal, Mr. Franklin, has any remarks, and then we'll let Dr. Levin speak for a couple of minutes about PACT.
I think the greatest reason that I was interested in this is because, number one, it's affects the personal of my own child, but more so, we've had about 7, 8 kids this year that have attempted suicide, not had thoughts, but have attempted suicide. We have one student now that's been placed in a permanent location to help him get the support that we need. The problem is bigger than what we think it is, and our kids are struggling mightily with this issue. So I thank you all for coming out, and I thank you, Ms. Walker and Ms. Harris, for your efforts to make this happen, because it may make a difference in one person's life. But I bet to your husband and your child, that's important. To your husband and child, that's important. Or to your mother, your father, that one person makes a difference. And so I'm extremely encouraged in that light, that it may make a difference. It may be a resource for someone, or they may have heard something in the presentation. So please tell parents that are here and employees that are here, Mr. Lynn is recording this. It will be on our YouTube channel. If you don't know where that is, parents, if you just go to our website at tms.dcssga.org, if you look at the bottom of the page, or near the mascot, there's a little play sign. When you click there, it'll take you to our YouTube website, and you can replay that. And to show that for someone, for parents that may not have come, or you want to show it to someone that may be struggling with these issues, so that might be of a benefit for them. So, thank you.
Hello, everyone. So, this is Miss Lark. She's our parent outreach facilitator, and just 2 things to say. Your students should have given you their compacts for you to sign and return, and